Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this critically important conversation this morning. I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today and recognize Ms. Thomas and Ms. Darkus for your work on behalf of struggling student loan borrowers throughout the Commonwealth. The testimony shared today underscores the severity of the student debt crisis taking place in our country. This crisis has placed an unprecedented financial burden and caused a tsunami of hurt on an entire generation of young people, hindering their ability to purchase homes, start a family, and even to save for retirement. Across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, more than 855,000 borrowers owe $33 billion in student debt. Last year alone, student loan debt in Massachusetts increased by $1 billion. Despite the fact that this crisis has reached record proportions, this administration has either failed to act or has intentionally worked to undermine state efforts to protect borrowers. Back in March, I asked CFPB Director Kraninger if she believed that there was a student debt crisis in our country. She refused to answer my question, a shocking but not surprising response from the person running the sole agency charged with protecting student loan borrowers in the financial marketplace. So I'm glad to be at this hearing to talk about the steps that state policymakers and state attorney generals have made to protect borrowers. The student debt crisis is a racial and economic justice issue as well. Ms. Darkus, tackling student debt is both a racial and economic justice issue. So how is student debt exacerbating the racial and gender wealth gap?
We see that in order to afford a college education these days, people of color disproportionately rely on debt to make it through. So when we look at what's happening in repayment, it's disheartening to see that the very same people who are trying to take advantage of the promise of education to achieve better economic outcomes for their families, to experience the economic mobility that education is supposed to promise, end up getting bogged down. The cost of that education increase through service or misconduct and error, and they disproportionately experience default. And since women bear so much student loan debt, we're also cognizant that they carry a special burden, and we should be looking out for outcomes based on gender in repayment as well.
Okay, so picking up on that, so federal student loan borrowers have a right, all of them, to an affordable monthly payment regardless of their loan balance through income-driven repayment or IDR, correct?
Yes.
Okay, but research has shown that when a borrower is able to get into and stay in an IDR plan, she is significantly less likely to default on her student loan, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so despite the fact that federal student loan borrowers have a right to an affordable payment, research has shown that Black and Latinx borrowers face significantly more challenges as they try to access these repayment plans. So this reflects many of the disparate impact trends we see in mortgage redlining abuses. Ms. Darkus, can you share some of the real-world consequences when a low-income borrower falls into default?
Unfortunately, the default triggers a world of hurt for clients like mine, many of whom are people of color and women. They can have their wages garnished, they can have their tax refunds, including the earned income tax credit, seized. And what we end up seeing is that the limited income and wealth that exists in communities of color gets siphoned off through these government debt collection activities, and that means that the racial wealth gap is growing due to student loans.
Okay, then. So do you believe this is evidence of potential discriminatory behavior or misconduct in the student loan market?
We definitely have to look at the disparate impact in student loan outcomes based on race and gender. And so we've got to look at, is discrimination happening in servicing, because the outcomes are stark. People of color fare worse.
All right, thank you. Mr. Thomas, the Massachusetts AG's office under the leadership of Attorney General Maura Healey has worked diligently to increase oversight over these servicers. In 2017, your office brought a suit against the Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency, or PHEA, for their egregious servicing failures that ultimately caused many borrowers to lose eligibility for the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program. Can you briefly explain the major findings of your case? I'm sorry, Mr.
Our allegations include that PHEA has denied borrowers the opportunity to make qualifying payments for public service loan forgiveness and income-driven repayment forgiveness by failing to properly and timely process applications for income-driven repayment plans. We have also alleged that the company failed to properly count borrowers' public service loan forgiveness qualifying payments. Further, we have alleged that they have failed to properly process Teach Grant certification forms, leading grants that were given to teachers to be converted to loans. Finally, we have alleged that FIA has collected amounts not legitimately due and owing and failing to refund them to borrowers.
The gentlelady's time